Hi everyone, my name is Aubrey. I tackle the taxation of the Philippines. First, I tackle the Philippine tax system. According to my research, the Philippine tax system is a tax law in the Philippines covers the two. The two is national and local taxes. First, national taxes refer to national internal revenue taxes exposed and collected by national government through the Bureau of Internal Revenue or the called BIR. But the local taxes refer to those imposed and collected by the local government. The rule of taxation should be uniform and equitable. The history of taxation in the Philippines is that during the Spanish period, new income-generating means were introduced by the government such as the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, Polo-wide servicio or forced labor, bandala, and kame system, and the last is tribute. But I have a question. When did the taxation start in the Philippines? According to my research, the basic source of Philippine tax law is the National Internal Revenue Law, or the latest version of which is the National Internal Revenue Code of 1997, or also known as the Tax Reform Act of 1997, approved on December 11, 1997. And there are the types of taxes in the Philippines, but I will give 5 types of taxations in the Philippines. First is the capital gain tax. Second, the communicable stamp tax. Third is donor's tax. 4 is the state tax. And 5 is the income tax. Thank you for watching. Enjoy!
The present law of income tax is contained in the Income Tax Act, 1961. The Income Tax Act contains the provision for determination of taxable income, determination of tax liability procedure for assessment, appeal, penalties, and prosecution. It also lays down the power and duties of various income tax authorities. The Income Tax Law comprises the Income Tax Act 1961, Income Tax Rules 1962, notification and circulars issued by Central Board of Direct Taxes, CBDT, Annual Finance Act, and judicial pronouncement by Supreme Court and High Court. Taxation not only pays for public goods and services, it's also a key ingredient in the social contact between citizen and the economy. Government also need to design a tax compliance system that will not discourage taxpayers from participating. To foster economic growth and development, governments need sustainable sources of funding for social programs and public investments. Programs providing health, education, infrastructure, and other services are important to achieve the common goal of a prosperous, functional, and orderly society. And they require that governments raise revenues. Taxation not only pays for public goods and services, it is also a key ingredient in the social contract between citizen and the economy. How taxes are raised and spent can determine a government very legitimacy. Holding government accountable encourages the effective administration of tax revenues and, more widely, good public financial management. All government need revenue, but the challenge is to carefully choose not only the level of tax rates but also the tax base. Governments also need to design a tax compliance system that will not discourage taxpayers from participating. Recent firm survey data for 147 economies show that companies consider tax rates to be among the top 5 concentrates to their operation and tax administration to be among the top 11. Firms in economies that score between on the doing business is of paying taxes indicator tend to perceive both tax rates and tax administration as less of an obstacle to be business. Manila was heart of the Spanish colony in the Philippines. Much of the international trade conducted by Spain in Asia was linked to Manila somehow, and most of the rich and powerful had their homes here. The Spaniards in Manila lived in the walled city of Intramuros. The governor, administrators, friars, merchants, military officials, priests, and soldiers from Spain and some of their family all resided within the walls. Outside the walls was the polyglot community of Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese, and other foreigners. Those that profited and the most from trade and other economic activities, primarily the Spanish elite wore fine silk traveled around unelegant coaches, wore gold chains and gems tumbling, and were looked after by an armed observant. What went on the Philippines was similar to what happened in Latin America. The Spanish seized land and established huge plantations which made rich men out of the landowners. Some of the indigenous people mixed with the Spanish. Some were overwhelmed by them. Both groups adopted Catholicism. Other groups, like the Igorot, resisted. The Spanish burned Igorot villages, destroyed their crops, and raped their women. Yet in 350 years of the Spanish occupation, the Igorot were never conquered. The Spanish were not as harsh on the local people of the Philippines as they were in Latin America, but they did make an effort to stamp out tradition and customs they regarded as work of the devil. Large number of people were untouched by the Spanish occupation. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines has been considered to be one of the darkest events on all Philippines history. It all started on the invasion of the island on December 8, 1941, when the Japanese planes from Taiwan raided American strategic bases in Iba and Clark airfields. This happened just 10 hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese Air Force continued bombing other locations in Philippines until they almost annihilated the American air power in the country. Soon the Japanese forces were able to land march on the northern area of the Philippines, eventually reaching as far as Atimonan and Mauban in Quezon Province on December 24, 1941. The capital Manila effortless fell into Japanese hands as it was declared as an open city by the General Douglas MacArthur to save it from utter destruction. Bataan and Corregidor. Without any aerial support to back them up, the defending forces of the combined Filipinos and Americans were forced to retreat the Bataan Peninsula. The defenders planned to make Bataan the base of operation for the resistance, hoping for the arrival of American reinforcement that never came. Still, the forces of Bataan managed to hold their grounding, spite of stimulation attack for the Japanese plans, and alternatively, another base for the Philippine resistance against the Japanese is the fortress island of Corregidor. Bataan and Corregidor remained the last line of defense in Southeast Asia for weeks until hunger and disease promoted the commanders of the outposts to surrender. The Japanese captured over 76,000 posts in Bataan, forcing them to march in a distance of about 100 kilometers starting from the Mariveles to Capas in Tarlac. Many of the prison were beaten on the way and weakened by either hunger or exhaustion after long hours of working in the searing heat of the suns. Many died in this ordeal, and these Japanese atrocity become known as the Bataan Death March. Life during the Japanese occupation. Through the introduction of currency known as the monkey mouse money, the Japanese seized control of the Philippines economy. There is an alarming proportion of inflation, and all the costs of foods, medicines, and other important necessities started to rise. This resulted in hunger and further spread of disease such as malaria, dysentery, and tuberculosis. Filipinos lived with a constant feeling of fear towards the Japanese, forgetting to go after a Japanese officer and sometimes result in onslaught in the face. The Kepitai or the Japanese secret police hired some Filipinos to report of anybody is a member or sympathizer of the guerrilla resistance. The secret police will then capture those persons regardless of whether they are innocent or not. They simply disappeared without any trace at all. Filipino resistance. Despite the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, the resistance against Japanese rule endured. Several surviving Filipino and Americans officers who refused to surrender to the Japanese resorted to unconventional guerrilla warfare movement during that time is the Hukbalahap or Hukbo ng Bayan laban sa Hapon. But because of their conflicting ideologies with the Americans, the communists, guerrillas did not receive much support from the alliance. The other, however, continued to establish effective communication with the Americans by reporting intelligence about Japanese movement in the country. Originally limited the Spanish, and the guerrillas eventually focuses on the sabotaging the enemy by doing surprise raids and capturing some Japanese soldiers, as seen in this picture. In return, the Americans supplied the guerrillas with arms and communication together with the medical and food supplies. The return of MacArthur. Prior to the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, General Douglas MacArthur needed the order of us President Roosevelt to leave the Philippines and command the American forces in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur then pledged to the Filipinos via radio the famous lines, "I shall return." He finally fulfilled his promise when his forces landed in Leyte on October 20, 1944. He walked shores of Leyte with President Sergio Osmeña. The arriving Americans were fresh from winning the Battle of Midway, which gave them the upper hand of the war against the Japanese. Osmeña declared the restoration of the Commonwealth government with Tacloban as the temporary capital. The American and Filipinos forces with the assistance of local guerrillas started to liberate specific location held by the Japanese Mindoro, Palawan, and Negros. Slowly fell back into the hands of Americans. Manila was cleared out of the Japanese on March 3, 1945, but with a high price. The city was completely devastated with 100,000 civilians dead, making Manila the second most damaged city in World War II, next only to Warsaw in Poland. The Philippines were finally declared fully liberated on the 4th of July 1945, ending the 3 years worth of Japanese rule to the country.